And why do you think that security has become so important? You called it the language of the world.
Yes, it's a good question. I think there are very many reasons, but I think modern life, modern society is very much characterized by a discourse of security, a discourse of risk and danger. And there are many, many reasons for that. Modern life is very much characterized by ever more complex environments where we don't know our neighbors, we don't know who lives next door. So instead of that face-to-face relationship or the knowledge that we would have of our neighbors or our families, our extended families in a small village, we have to rely on more distant, abstract systems and institutions that give us the knowledge to just operate in our daily lives. So we start thinking, and society starts organizing itself in terms of minimizing risk, minimizing danger. And I think that in itself heightens the sense of insecurity. And because security is very much subjective, once we become aware of our potential insecurity, we feel we need more and more security. So we want to buy more security, we want to build that wall a little bit higher, and we have all kinds of other factors like much reporting and interest in crime, so crime can be going down like it is in most societies in the West. But if you ask people on the street, they will be absolutely convinced that it's much more dangerous and there's much, much more crime today than before. So there is this prevailing discourse of security and danger that I think feeds off and comes from a whole lot of different factors and discourses within just the conditions of modern life. And of course, I should mention, since September 11th, for example, this has taken on yet another dimension. So we surround ourselves with even more security technologies, which again makes us think whenever we enter an airport that, if there's all this security, then this must be a dangerous place. So the logic is in its, almost never ending. If you had a private security company in Nairobi, as a provider to guard your house, you had a break-in. You phoned your private security company, they would come to your house, but because they are unarmed, they would also rely or want to have the police come in with an armed capacity or just for the powers of arrest. When that relationship between the public and the private breaks down, the ability of the private to respond is declining, and it also puts the private providers very much at risk because they will be the first line of defense against potentially intruders that are armed, and they will have only a whistle and a little stick. So, final point, one other thing that was very noticeable in Nairobi was that private security work was very, very dangerous. Those private security guards faced armed intruders, oftentimes quite heavily armed intruders, with absolutely no means of self-defense. So what we saw was quite a lot of loss of life and quite a lot of injuries among private security guards, which is something that was very, very much the case both here and in Mombasa.
Do you think that's something that's going to change, or will this situation remain?
I think it probably will remain for a while, but I think also the way companies are trying to deal with it is to put other types of security technologies in place. So instead of putting a guard there, a human being whose life can be lost, they will try and use exclusionary measures like barbed wire or surveillance cameras and so forth. Anything to try and not put lives at risk. But I think when you have a situation of unarmed guards in highly insecure environments, the guard is very much at risk. I think some people would say, if you arm the guard, then their lives are going to be more secure. But most private security companies will tell you that if you arm a guard, they're even more of a target, because then potential criminals or all kinds of people would try and attack the guard to steal the weapon. So arming the guards is absolutely not the solution here, and I think that's very important to underline. I would say that you would make both the guards and the public at large more insecure if you arm private providers.
Talked in your keynote speech about taxation as an entry point to violence. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, this is the question was about taxation in Mogadishu, and I'd made the point earlier that the authority that I considered to be the most effective taxing authority in Mogadishu were Shabab groups, and the question then was, well, how do you know, or how do you see this? And I said that the entry point for understanding this was violence. So what I do is I look at how violence is used to communicate a message to a community. So the example was the killing of a trader in the main market in Mogadishu, and then the trader's body is left in some prominent spot with a note that says, "Do not remove this body." And what that showed me is who actually controls that place, who controls that market. Because if people don't remove the body, they must think that the person or the group that killed that individual must have information, must be able to know who would remove the body. This means they must have connections to other people. They must have informants. They must have credible information. They must be able to get reliable information there. So that shows me who controls. And in who controls, that control is very important in being able to enforce a taxation system. So in looking at business in Mogadishu, I mean, one of the people complain about taxation, I guess, in all societies in some way or another. And one hears complaints or rumors or discussions about taxation by Shabab, or what people who are associated with Shabab. And it struck me that seems to be more systematic in 2013 in Mogadishu than, say, the government's capacity to tax people. So the government appears to be very weak. These other forces in the urban society appear to be strong, that they have a say in how the city is run and who is able to do business there, what are the terms of business and so forth, and then to be able to extract money from them and then use that money in a political fashion to support the power of the group, or demonstrate that their force has to be dealt with.
What role does the mini warlords play in this taxation issue?
So the mini warlords, these are people who have played political roles, but I think now in 2013 are seen mostly as businessmen. These are Somali businessmen. But these are people who, depending on what the circumstances, their position in society makes them very adaptable. So in times of greater turmoil, they can become protectors they're on kinship networks, so-called sub-clans, and these sorts of things. If there are negotiations here in Nairobi or some other place, then they're powerful enough that, now they're politicians and they must be invited to the negotiations. Foreigners, U.S. government, let's say in the mid-2000s, may see them as capable of mobilizing fighters and allies in war against terror, so they play that role. But where we see them now in Mogadishu is mostly as businessmen. Some of them, they do things like run hotels, and some of them run Somali private security companies and so forth, trying to take advantage of opportunities, contracts, maybe from AMISOM. That's a tricky thing because you can aggravate the taxing authority if you do that. Mm-hmm. But you see, these are people that they stand between worlds, so they're able to shift to different social milieus, and so I think it is possible in Mogadishu for somebody to have a contract with some international actor, still pay taxes to what might be called the insurgents, still have to deal with sort of this weak central government that's in Mogadishu. But these are people who, when you meet them on an individual basis, because of this, they're also the people who are able to solve problems and get things done and so forth. So I call them mini warlords. That's actually a term a friend of mine uses. So it's his term to distinguish them from the big warlords. These are the people maybe we've heard of in movies like Black Hawk Down and so forth. And so the mini ones, these are locally important, but not in the movies.
Yeah.